Hey guys, tonight we drift into a city that smells like salt, papyrus, and ambition. You're standing on a stone quay in Alexandria, right now in the present tense, while lantern light trembles across black water and ships creak like they're clearing their throats before telling secrets. The harbor is loud even at night. Ropes slap masts, sailors mutter prayers to gods they only half believe in, and somewhere nearby a vendor is still arguing about fish prices because capitalism, apparently, never sleeps. And rising just inland from all this noise is a place that doesn't trade in grain or gold, but in something far more fragile: ideas. You probably won't survive this, by which I mean your modern sense of information abundance is about to be deeply uncomfortable. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Are you wrapped in a blanket at midnight? On a bus somewhere else pretending not to fall asleep? I like knowing where these stories land. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk inland, away from the docks, and the city changes texture under your feet. Alexandria is young, but it already knows it's important. Founded by Alexander the Great, planned like a grid by people who believed geometry could tame chaos, it feels less like a city that grew and more like a city that was declared. Wide streets, marble ambition, a sense that someone, somewhere, wrote a master plan and expected reality to follow along politely. And somewhere within this ordered sprawl, historians still argue exactly where, which is fitting. You sense the beginning of something audacious. Not a building yet, not even shelves. Just an idea floating in the minds of rulers and scholars who think, sincerely, that the entire world can be collected, categorized, and understood if you just gather enough scrolls and lock enough clever people in one place with free meals. This is the seed of the Library of Alexandria. At first, it's not even called that in the way you imagine. It's tied to something broader, something stranger. The Museion, a kind of research institute/temple/residence hall dedicated to the muses. Yes, those muses, the divine patrons of memory, poetry, astronomy, history, and all the things that make people annoying at dinner parties. This matters because knowledge here isn't just practical. It's sacred. Learning is worship. Arguing over footnotes is basically a religious act. Academia hasn't changed much. You can almost feel the optimism humming in the air. This is the early Hellenistic world, after Alexander's empire has cracked apart into rival kingdoms, each trying to prove it inherited not just territory, but legitimacy. Egypt, under the Ptolemies, has a problem. The rulers are Greek, the population is Egyptian, and everyone's watching to see if this experiment collapses. One solution? Become the intellectual capital of the world. If you can't be loved, be indispensable. So the plan forms: collect every book ever written. Not metaphorically. Literally. Every poem, every medical treatise, every play, every local myth scratched onto papyrus in some dusty backwater. Bring it here. Copy it. Study it. Keep it. The arrogance is breathtaking. The confidence is unhinged. And somehow, for a while, it works. You pass scribes hunched over low desks, their fingers stained black with ink, their eyes burning from hours of copying text letter by careful letter. Papyrus rustles softly, a sound like dry leaves whispering secrets. There's a mainstream historical fact tucked right here. Ancient sources claim the library eventually held hundreds of thousands of scrolls. The exact number varies wildly, which is your first clue that we're already drifting into legend. But even conservative estimates suggest a collection unlike anything the world had seen before. And then there's the quirky tidbit that always makes modern listeners blink. Ships entering Alexandria's harbor were reportedly searched for books. Any texts found were confiscated, copied by the library's scribes, and only then returned, sometimes with the copy sent back and the original kept. Polite? Effective? Extremely. Somewhere, a sailor is still mad about this. You pause because it hits you. This place isn't neutral. It's not a cozy community library with beanbags and story hour. It's an imperial project. Knowledge here is power. Whoever controls texts controls narratives, history, science, religion, law. Historians still argue whether the Ptolemies were idealistic patrons of learning or ruthless cultural hoarders with good PR. The answer, inconveniently, is probably both. As you wander deeper, you sense that this story will not be neat. The library is already wrapped in contradictions. It is celebrated as a beacon of reason, yet built by monarchs. It welcomes scholars, yet excludes most of the city's population. It preserves texts, yet may have erased others by deciding what was worth copying. Even at its birth, the library casts a long, complicated shadow. You hear laughter echoing down a colonnade, scholars arguing about poetry metrics like their lives depend on it. Someone storms off dramatically, because of course they do. There's a joke circulating that if you want to avoid manual labor forever, become a philosopher. Free housing, free food, and a lifetime supply of intellectual beef. The ancient equivalent of tenure, minus the email. And hovering over all of this is memory itself. The fear that knowledge can be lost. That civilizations forget. That scrolls burn, rot, or are simply never copied again. The library is born from that anxiety, the desire to pin down human thought before time sweeps it away. You can feel the urgency even now because you know how this story ends. Or at least you think you do. Historians still argue whether there was ever a single moment of destruction at all, or whether the library faded in stages, like a candle burning lower and lower until no one remembers who lit it. But that comes later. For now, you're standing at the beginning, when hope outweighs caution and ambition hasn't yet learned the word consequences. The shelves are being planned. The rules are being written. The dream is still intact. And as you take one last look at the harbor lights flickering behind you, you step fully into a place that believes, truly believes, that the entire world can fit inside a room, if you just organize it properly. You keep walking because once you step into Alexandria's intellectual gravity, it doesn't really let go. The salt air thins, replaced by the smell of ink, oil lamps, and that particular human aroma of too many thinkers living indoors together. This is where the dream from the harbor hardens into policy, and policy hardens into stone. Behind it all stands a family with a talent for ambition and a tolerance for chaos. The Ptolemies. You don't meet them directly. This isn't that kind of story, but you feel their presence everywhere. Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's former generals, has inherited Egypt and promptly decided that ruling is easier when people believe you're inevitable. Armies help. Gold helps. But knowledge? Knowledge makes your kingdom feel permanent. So the library is no side project. It's state-sponsored brilliance. Tax-funded curiosity. An empire flexing with scrolls instead of swords, though, let's be honest, it still has plenty of swords too. Here's the mainstream historical fact grounding you. The library and Museion were supported directly by the royal treasury. Scholars received stipends, housing, and meals. This matters because it means thinking itself becomes a profession. You're no longer just a poet scribbling between farming seasons. You're on payroll, which sounds lovely until you remember who signs the checks. You watch as invitations are sent across the Greek-speaking world. Philosophers from Athens. Astronomers from the Eastern Mediterranean. Physicians from places where medicine smells suspiciously like herbs and prayers. The pitch is irresistible. Come here, argue with the smartest people alive, and never worry about rent again. The catch is subtle. You are here because the king allows it. And kings, as a general rule, don't fund things without expecting something back. There's a gentle hum of optimism, but also tension. Alexandria is not Athens. Free speech exists, sort of, but it has guardrails. You learn quickly which topics earn applause and which earn uncomfortable silence. Praise the dynasty? Undermine royal legitimacy? Risky. Knowledge is encouraged, but not chaos. Think freely, just not that freely. Academia, once again, hasn't changed much. A quirky tidbit floats past you like gossip on a breeze. The Ptolemies allegedly kept scholars under something resembling house arrest. Not locked in chains, nothing dramatic, but discouraged from leaving. Free food, freedom to wander off and take your brilliance elsewhere? Less so. Some ancient writers joke that the Museion was a golden cage. Soft beds, warm meals, Endless debates. No exit sign. You stroll through a courtyard where arguments spill into the open air. Someone is loudly insisting Homer could not have written all of Homer. Someone else is offended on Homer's behalf, despite Homer being very dead and presumably unconcerned. This is what the Ptolemies are buying: prestige. The sound of brilliance echoing through marble halls. A city that feels like the brain of the Mediterranean. And here's where the deeper ambition sharpens. It's not enough to collect Greek texts. That would be easy, and frankly a little lazy. The real power move is universal knowledge. Egyptian religious texts, Babylonian astronomy, Persian histories. Even rumors of works from India drift through conversations. If knowledge exists anywhere, it should exist here. Alexandria doesn't just want to be the smartest city. It wants to be the last city you need. Historians still argue whether this universalism was genuine curiosity or cultural dominance in disguise. When you collect everyone's books, translate them into your language, and store them under your roof, who owns the story? Is this preservation or appropriation with nicer lighting? You pass scribes working under strict rules. Accuracy matters. Copy errors are enemies. Yet mistakes happen. A missing line here. A rephrased metaphor there. Over generations, texts subtly shift. Ironically, the place dedicated to preserving knowledge also becomes a source of variation. It's like a cosmic joke. The more you try to freeze information, the more it changes shape. There's a soft chuckle in the room as someone mentions that the king himself enjoys intellectual debates. This is either charming or terrifying, depending on how well you argue. Imagine presenting a theory about the nature of the cosmos while knowing the person judging you could also order your exile before lunch. Keeps the mind sharp, keeps the jokes gentle. And yes, there's a joke going around tonight. If you disagree with the king, do it using footnotes. Apparently, dissent sounds more respectful when it's formatted. As night settles, oil lamps flicker, casting shadows that stretch like long thoughts across the walls. You realize that the library's power isn't just in its shelves. It's in its system. Knowledge is gathered, filtered, debated, and ranked. Some ideas are elevated, others quietly sidelined. This is where canon begins, not because something is true, but because someone important decided it was worth keeping. You feel the weight of it now. The library isn't just saving the past. It's shaping the future. What survives here may define what later civilizations believe ancient people thought. That's a terrifying amount of influence for a few rooms full of scrolls and opinionated humans with good handwriting. Still, for all the politics humming beneath the surface, there's wonder too. Genuine wonder. You see it in the way scholars forget to eat because they're mid-argument. In the way a new text arriving from far away is treated like a minor miracle. In the way curiosity feels contagious, like laughter in a crowded room. You linger, knowing this balance between idealism and control won't hold forever. But right now, the blueprint is set. The funding flows. The minds gather. And the library, no longer just a dream, begins to pulse like a living thing at the center of the city. You wake up inside the Museion before you realize you've fallen asleep there. Not literally, don't panic, but the rhythm of the place has that effect. Days blur. Nights stretch. Meals happen when someone remembers food exists. The Museion isn't a single room or even a single building. It's a lived-in ecosystem of colonnades, lecture halls, gardens, dining rooms, and quiet corners where someone is always muttering to themselves. If the library is the brain, this is the nervous system. You step into a communal dining hall where scholars eat together at long tables, because nothing fuels intellectual conflict quite like shared bread and wine. This is a mainstream historical fact that tends to surprise people. Residents of the Museion were expected to dine communally. Knowledge here isn't solitary. It's performative. You think in public. You argue in public. You are wrong in public. For some, this is exhilarating. For others, it's a waking nightmare with good acoustics. The conversations crash into each other. Poetry theory bleeds into astronomy. Someone tries to explain geometry using olives as props. Someone else is offended by the olives being misused. You notice how often arguments loop back to definitions. What counts as truth? What counts as evidence? What counts as plagiarism? Yes, even here. Especially here. A quirky tidbit floats through the chatter. Scholars at the Museion are exempt from taxes. It's mentioned casually, but you can feel the ripple it causes. This isn't just a perk, it's a statement. The state values thinking enough to literally remove financial friction. Of course, it also makes scholars dependent on the state, which is either supportive or sinister depending on your mood and caffeine intake. You wander into a garden where philosophy lectures happen while walking, because sitting still apparently makes thinking too easy. Teachers pace slowly, hands clasped behind their backs, delivering ideas like they're scattering seeds. Students follow, occasionally tripping over loose stones or their own assumptions. Someone asks a question so complex it takes 5 minutes just to repeat it accurately. There's polite applause for the effort alone. Historians still argue whether the Museion functioned more like a modern university or a royal think tank with better landscaping. The answer, again inconveniently, seems to be both. Research happens here for its own sake. Mathematics that won't help anyone build a bridge for centuries, but also for prestige, navigation, calendars, and administration. Pure curiosity and practical governance share the same hallways, occasionally bumping shoulders and pretending not to notice. You notice how competitive the atmosphere is. Brilliant minds don't always make for gentle company. Reputation matters. Being quoted matters. Being remembered matters. There's an unspoken hierarchy based on who's been cited, who's been invited to speak, who gets interrupted less often. Someone mutters that the only thing more dangerous than ignorance is a scholar with a fragile ego. No one disagrees. There's a light joke circulating today. The Museion has everything: food, shelter, books, except silence. Someone suggests inventing a room just for not talking. Another scholar immediately begins theorizing about the philosophical implications of silence, and the idea dies on the spot. You slip into a lecture where a scholar is arguing that knowledge should be classified not by subject, but by method. This is bold, possibly career-ending, possibly brilliant. You feel the tension ripple through the room as people mentally calculate how safe it is to agree. This is the subtle pressure of patronage at work. You are free to think, but some thoughts travel farther than others. And yet, despite all of this, there's something intoxicating here. The sense that the human mind, collectively, is capable of more than anyone expected. You see collaborations spark mid-argument. You see ideas evolve in real time. Someone storms out angrily, then returns 10 minutes later having revised their position and their tone. Growth happens. So does pettiness. It's a full-spectrum intellectual experience. As evening falls, oil lamps glow again, and the Museion softens. Arguments quiet into murmurs. Scrolls are rolled and unrolled with reverent care. You overhear someone planning tomorrow's lecture with the seriousness of a military campaign. Knowledge here is not casual. It's work. Sacred work. Exhausting work. You realize that the library could never exist without this living community. Scrolls alone are inert. It's the arguing, the teaching, the relentless questioning that gives them life. The Museion is where ideas breathe, and occasionally suffocate under the weight of too many opinions. You linger at the edge of the garden, listening to cicadas buzz like static in the warm air, and you understand something quietly important. This place isn't perfect. It's human. Brilliant, biased, ambitious, fragile. And because of that, it feels real. Tomorrow, the scroll hunters will go back to work. But tonight, the minds rest, uneasily, imperfectly, dreaming of answers that might exist just one argument away. You follow the noise first. It's not shouting, more like controlled chaos. The scrape of crates. The thud of ropes being cut loose. The frustrated sigh of a customs official who knows, deep down, that today's paperwork will never end. You've made your way back toward the harbor, because this is where the library's hunger becomes visible. The scroll hunters are at work. Every ship that docks in Alexandria carries more than grain or wine. It carries stories, laws, recipes, medical advice that may or may not involve goat fat. And the city treats these texts the way dragons treat gold. carefully, possessively, with a willingness to steal if necessary. Here's your mainstream historical fact anchoring the scene. Ancient sources describe a policy where books found on incoming ships were seized, copied by library scribes, and sometimes replaced with a copy while the original stayed behind. The originals were labeled from the ships, which is a wonderfully polite way of saying, "We took this." You imagine the sailors' faces when they realized their prized texts weren't coming back. Somewhere, a captain is still telling this story bitterly, centuries later, to anyone who will listen. You stand near a table where scrolls are being unrolled for inspection. Language after language passes beneath careful eyes: Greek, Egyptian, Phoenician, scripts you don't recognize but feel heavy with meaning. Some texts are obvious treasures. Others look mundane: merchant logs, local ordinances, regional myths no one outside a small town has ever cared about. The library wants them all, especially the boring ones. Those are the ones that vanish first when no one's watching. A quirky tidbit circulates among the scribes like gossip. The library once paid a massive sum to borrow the official Athenian copies of famous Greek tragedies, only to return replicas and keep the originals. They even forfeited the deposit on purpose. Petty? Effective? Also yes. Cultural theft with impeccable handwriting. You watch scribes move with disciplined speed. There's no romantic candlelit solitude here. This is industrial knowledge processing. Teams work in shifts. One reads aloud. Another writes. A third checks for errors. It's exhausting, meticulous labor, and mistakes are punished not with lashes but with reputation damage, which in this place might be worse. Historians still argue whether this aggressive collecting saved ancient literature or distorted it beyond recognition. Every copy introduces potential changes. A word here, a line there. Over centuries, those tiny shifts can snowball. The library preserves, but it also edits, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes not. You notice how power flows through this system. The Ptolemies decide which languages are prioritized, which cultures get translated, which texts are deemed worthy of the time and ink. This isn't a neutral archive, it's a filter. The world enters Alexandria, but Alexandria decides what version of the world survives. Someone cracks a quiet joke as a particularly tedious scroll is unrolled. Congratulations, they whisper. You've discovered the world's first terms and conditions. Laughter ripples, then dies quickly as a supervisor walks past. Humor is allowed. Too much humor is suspicious. You drift toward a storage room stacked floor to ceiling with scroll containers. The air is dry, intentionally so. Papyrus hates moisture. Fire hates papyrus even more, but no one wants to think about that. Not now. Not while the dream is alive. Still, a flicker of unease passes through you. Everything here is fragile. Ink fades. Paper cracks. Knowledge, for all its power, is physically weak. You overhear an argument between two scholars about whether oral traditions should be written down at all. One insists writing preserves truth. The other argues it kills flexibility, freezes stories that were meant to breathe. Historians still argue whether the library's obsession with fixation did more harm than good. Did writing everything down save memory, or did it quietly erase the living voices behind it? As night approaches, the harbor quiets, but the work doesn't stop. Scrolls are carried inland like sacred contraband. Each one is a small victory. Each one is also a gamble. You realize that the library isn't just collecting knowledge. It's racing time itself, trying to outrun decay, disaster, and human forgetfulness. And for now, it's winning. Barely. You take one last look at the ships rocking gently in the dark water and feel the weight of what's being pulled from them. Not cargo, but civilizations compressed into fragile rolls of papyrus. Tomorrow, more ships will come. More texts will be taken. And the shelves will grow heavier with the past. You settle into a quieter room now because chaos only works if someone, somewhere, is obsessively organizing it. This is where you meet, not personally, don't worry, no awkward introductions, the spirit of Callimachus. Poet, scholar, librarian, and the kind of person who looks at an impossible mess and thinks, yes, but what if it had categories? The library has grown fat on scrolls. Shelves bow. Storage rooms multiply. Knowledge is pouring in faster than anyone can remember where anything is. You can feel the panic under the surface. What's the point of owning the world's texts if you can't find the one you want without yelling down a hallway and hoping someone smarter hears you? This is where the Pinocs come in. Here's your mainstream historical fact for the evening. Callimachus is traditionally credited with creating the Pinocs, a massive bibliographic catalog of the library's holdings. Not a simple list. Not a casual inventory. A full system that classifies works by genre, author, subject, and sometimes vibes, because ancient categorization gets creative. It's widely considered the ancestor of the modern library catalog, which means every time you've ever failed to find a book because the system made no sense, you are spiritually connected to this moment. You watch as order is imposed on chaos. Scrolls are labeled. Authors are debated. Genres are argued over like sports teams. Is history poetry if it's written beautifully? Is philosophy literature if it reads like a tantrum? Someone says yes. Someone says no. Someone storms off to write a counter-argument that will itself need to be catalogued later. The irony is delicious. A quirky tidbit sneaks in here. Callimachus himself famously disliked long, bloated works. He preferred elegance, precision, short forms. There's a rumor he openly criticized epic poets for writing big books for big idiots, which is either elite literary shade or the first recorded academic subtweet. Either way, you sense that personal taste absolutely influences how knowledge is sorted. Objectivity is the goal. Subjectivity is the reality. The Pinocs don't just tell you where a scroll is. They tell you why it matters. Each entry includes biographical notes about the author, summaries of content, sometimes judgments. This is subtle power. If a librarian describes your work as minor or derivative, congratulations, you've just been quietly downgraded for the next few centuries. Historians still argue whether the Pinocs were ever fully completed or whether they were constantly evolving, revised, and partially lost even within the library's own lifetime. It's comforting, in a dark way, to know that even the greatest catalog in antiquity struggled with version control. You lean over a scribe's shoulder as they copy catalog entries. The handwriting is immaculate. The patience is unreal. This is slow technology at its finest. No search bar. No filters. Just human memory, discipline, and an unspoken prayer that the shelf numbers don't change overnight. And this is where something quietly profound happens. The act of classification begins shaping thought itself. Once you divide knowledge into boxes, science here, poetry there, you encourage people to think in those boxes. Interdisciplinary thinking becomes harder. Boundaries feel more real than they are. The library organizes information, but it also organizes minds. There's a low-level joke circulating among the scholars. If it's not in the catalog, did it even exist? Nervous laughter follows. Because everyone here knows the answer is uncomfortably close to yes. You wander through a corridor where scroll containers are now arranged with ceremonial pride. Labels face outward. Order radiates. It's calming, almost hypnotic. You realize this is part of the library's seduction. Chaos is tiring. Order feels like truth, even when it's just a convenient illusion. Someone nearby grumbles that the catalog keeps changing. A text that was once listed under medicine is now philosophy. Another has been demoted from essential to supplementary. Academic status anxiety is alive and thriving. There's a betting pool on which authors will be remembered in 100 years. No one bets on themselves. Superstition runs deep. And yet, for all the quiet politics, the Pinocs are revolutionary. For the first time, knowledge is systematically mapped. You don't just store information, you navigate it. You can trace intellectual lineages, compare traditions, see patterns emerge across cultures. The library stops being a hoard and becomes a tool. You pause, letting that sink in. This is the moment where humanity starts believing information can be mastered, not just inherited. That it can be sorted, evaluated, improved. It's intoxicating. It's dangerous. It's very on brand for us. As lamps dim and scribes stretch aching fingers, you sense a shift. The library has crossed a threshold. It's no longer just collecting the past. It's actively curating it, deciding what matters, deciding what survives. And somewhere in that quiet room, between neat labels and judgment calls, the future of memory is being quietly rewritten, one catalog entry at a time. You don't notice the language shift at first. It creeps up on you the way fatigue does, quietly, politely, and then all at once you realize you're surrounded by words you almost understand. Greek is everywhere here, smoothed and standardized, the library's preferred operating system. But tucked into side rooms and shaded courtyards, something else is happening. Translation. Not casual translation. Not someone idly swapping words over wine. This is organized, funded, and borderline obsessive. The library wants the world's knowledge, but it wants it readable, which usually means Greek. And that means turning thousands of years of local traditions into something that fits the rhythm and assumptions of a different culture. Here's your mainstream historical fact sliding gently into place. One of the most famous translation projects associated with Alexandria is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, traditionally called the Septuagint. According to later accounts, Jewish scholars were invited, or summoned, depending on how spicy you like your history, to translate their sacred texts into Greek so they could sit on the library's shelves and be accessible to the wider Hellenistic world. The legend is dramatic. 72 translators. 72 separate rooms. All producing identical translations, word for word, by divine inspiration. It's the kind of story that makes librarians misty-eyed and historians deeply suspicious. Historians still argue whether this miracle narrative reflects reality, symbolism, or very enthusiastic PR from people who wanted the translation to carry unquestionable authority. You step into a room where translation is less miraculous and more exhausting. Scholars argue over a single word for an hour. Does this term mean law, teaching, or instruction? The choice matters. It shapes theology, philosophy, politics. You watch someone rub their temples and mutter that they just want a word that behaves itself. Language, unfortunately, refuses. A quirky tidbit floats through the room like a whispered confession. Some translators are accused, by later critics, of subtly adjusting meanings to make texts sound more respectable to Greek philosophical tastes. Less divine tantrum, more abstract wisdom. Whether this was intentional or just cultural gravity doing its thing is still debated, but the effect is undeniable. Translation doesn't just move ideas. It transforms them. You realize how radical this is. Sacred texts, once bound to ritual language and local community, are now portable, discussable, critiquable. Once something is translated, it can be argued with, footnoted, misunderstood by people very confident they understand it. Progress, depending on your perspective. There's tension here. Some scholars worry that translation flattens nuance. Others argue that unshared knowledge is already half lost. A heated debate breaks out about whether meaning lives in words or in context. Someone suggests meaning lives in the reader. This earns groans. Philosophy jokes land better when everyone's tired. You catch another joke, this one quieter. Translation is just interpretation wearing good manners. It gets a few tired laughs and one very offended stare. Beyond religious texts, the translation fever spreads. Egyptian medical treatises. Babylonian astronomical records. Local myths that never expected to leave home. Everything is being pulled into a shared linguistic space. The upside is connection. The downside is homogenization. Alexandria is becoming a blender, and not everything survives the same. Historians still argue whether the library's translation culture preserved diversity or slowly erased it by privileging Greek frameworks. Once knowledge is translated, it often gets taught, debated, and remembered in its translated form. Originals become footnotes, then curiosities, then rumors. You notice how translation empowers comparison. Now scholars can line up different cultures' answers to the same questions. Where did the world come from? How should people live? What happens after death? It's exhilarating and destabilizing. When myths sit side by side, none of them feel quite as inevitable anymore. As night deepens, oil lamps glow low, and translators slump over their desks. Their work is invisible to most future generations, but foundational. Without them, the library would just be a museum of unreadable artifacts. With them, it becomes a conversation, messy, biased, transformative. You leave the room quietly, aware that something irreversible has happened. The world's ideas have begun to share a common tongue. Whether that's unity or loss depends on who you ask. Probably both. And somewhere behind you, a translator debates one last word long after everyone else has gone to sleep, knowing, without quite admitting it, that this choice might echo for centuries. You step outside just as the air cools enough to feel merciful. The arguments inside never really stop, but out here, under open sky, they soften. This is where the library's ambitions tilt upward, away from scrolls and toward the cosmos. You feel it the moment someone points, not at a text, but at the horizon. Mathematics and astronomy live comfortably in Alexandria. Numbers behave themselves better than words, and stars, at least, don't argue back. You find yourself standing near scholars who are less interested in myth and more interested in measurement. The question they keep circling isn't what do we believe, but how do we know? Here's your mainstream historical fact, delivered gently so it doesn't wake anyone. Eratosthenes, a scholar associated with the library, calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. No satellites, no GPS, just geometry, sunlight, and a dangerously confident belief that math could explain everything. He noticed that at noon on the summer solstice, the sun cast no shadow in one Egyptian city, while it did in Alexandria. From that angle difference, and the distance between the two, he worked out the size of the planet. You let that sit for a moment. Someone, 2,000 years ago, figured out the scale of your entire world using a stick and a shadow. A quiet awe settles over you. This isn't abstract philosophy. This is reality being measured into submission. Nearby, Euclid's influence hums like background music. His geometric principles don't shout. They whisper. Axioms. Proofs. Step-by-step logic that builds structures no storm can knock down. There's a reason his work lasts. It's not flashy. It's relentless. You hear someone joke that Euclid has no royal road to geometry, which is both a famous line and an excellent excuse for struggling students everywhere. A quirky tidbit surfaces here, because Alexandria can't help itself. Some ancient writers suggest that the library housed early mechanical devices, models of the heavens, automated gadgets, clever toys that blur the line between science and spectacle. Whether these were serious research tools or expensive distractions is unclear. Historians still argue whether such devices were central to Alexandrian science or just rich people showing off with gears. You lean against a column as scholars debate whether the Earth sits at the center of everything or whether it might be moving. The geocentric model feels safe, stable, comforting, but there are murmurs, doubts, calculations that don't quite line up unless you start bending assumptions. No one is ready to throw the Earth off-center yet, but the seed of discomfort has been planted. Progress often begins as an itch you can't scratch. The library thrives on this kind of tension. Measurement challenges myth. Observation challenges authority. And yet, tradition pushes back. There's respect for ancient thinkers, sometimes bordering on reverence. Correcting the past is allowed, but only if you do it politely and with enough equations to seem humble. You hear a soft joke pass between astronomers. The stars are easier to understand than people. Everyone laughs because everyone knows it's true. As night deepens, stars emerge one by one, clean and sharp in the dark. Scholars trace constellations with their fingers, arguing over names, origins, and whether certain patterns are universal or culturally specific. The sky becomes a shared text, open to anyone who looks up. No catalog required. Historians still argue how much of this scientific work truly originated in Alexandria versus how much was refined, preserved, or rebranded from earlier cultures. Babylonian astronomy, Egyptian measurement traditions, Greek mathematical formalism. Alexandria blends them all. Innovation here is often synthesis, which doesn't make it less impressive, just more honest. You realize something quietly important. The library isn't just preserving ideas. It's testing them against reality, against shadows, against stars, against numbers that don't care what you believe. This is a different kind of power, less theatrical than poetry, less comforting than myth, but harder to argue with once it settles in. As you step back inside, leaving the stars to their patient shining, you feel the scale of it all. The library has reached beyond Earth itself, measured it, and then kept going. And in doing so, it's gently, persistently teaching humanity that the universe is bigger and more knowable than it ever imagined. You notice the smell before anything else. Not unpleasant, just sharp. Herbs, oils, something metallic underneath. You've wandered into the parts of Alexandria where the library's curiosity turns inward, toward the human body itself. This is where knowledge gets personal, uncomfortable, occasionally controversial. Medicine here isn't mystical chanting in dark corners, though that still exists outside these walls. Inside, it's observation, comparison, argument. You watch physicians debate symptoms the way poets debate metaphors. Fever isn't just a curse, it's a pattern. Pain isn't punishment, it's data. And that shift, from divine cause to physical mechanism, is quietly revolutionary. Here's your mainstream historical fact anchoring this uneasy room. Alexandrian scholars made significant advances in anatomy and medicine, with figures like Herophilus and Erasistratus distinguishing between veins and arteries and identifying the brain as the center of the nervous system. Let that land gently. At a time when many cultures located thought in the heart, someone here is pointing at a brain and saying, "No, that's the control room." You stand very still because the next part is where things get murky. A quirky tidbit slides in, whispered more than spoken. Some ancient sources claim that human dissection, and possibly even vivisection, was practiced in Alexandria under royal approval. Criminals, they say, condemned prisoners. The claims are graphic enough that modern historians wince. Historians still argue whether these accounts are exaggerated polemic, later moralizing, or accurate descriptions of practices that were rare, controlled, and deliberately forgotten. You feel the weight of that uncertainty press down. This is the uncomfortable edge of progress, the question of how much suffering people are willing to justify in the name of knowledge. Even here, even now, there's no clean answer. The sources disagree. Motives blur. And time has softened details it didn't want to keep. What is clear is that Alexandria's physicians cared deeply about precision. They named parts. They traced systems. They argued that the pulse could reveal internal conditions. They treated the body as something that followed rules, even when those rules weren't fully understood. It's messy science, but it's science. Nearby, someone is cataloging medicinal plants, noting which calm pain, which stop bleeding, which probably don't do anything but smell nice. Another scholar jokes that half of medicine is observation and the other half is confidence. No one disagrees. Some things really don't change. You overhear a heated debate about whether disease spreads through imbalance or through invisible particles. The word particle hangs in the air, heavy and unresolved. No microscopes yet. Just intuition and argument. Still, the idea that illness might have physical agents rather than moral causes is creeping in, slowly, stubbornly. Historians still argue how far Alexandrian medicine truly broke from older traditions versus refining them with better terminology. Egyptian healing practices, Greek theories of humors, practical battlefield experience, all of it feeds into this place. Alexandria doesn't invent medicine from nothing. It reorganizes it, tests it, sometimes challenges it, sometimes bows to tradition when evidence runs out. As you leave, the smell fades, replaced again by papyrus and lamp oil. You feel unsettled but also impressed. This is knowledge that risks discomfort, that looks directly at what people are made of and refuses easy answers. The library's hunger doesn't stop at the stars or the past. It reaches into flesh and nerve, asking questions that still make us squirm. And as you step back into the wider halls, you understand that not all knowledge feels noble. Some of it is sharp-edged, ethically tangled, and forever debated. But once asked, those questions never really go away. You think, briefly, that the loudest arguments must be about stars or medicine or the soul. You're wrong. The real noise is coming from poetry. You drift into a hall where voices overlap like badly mixed audio and immediately feel the tension. This is literary territory, dangerous ground. Here, words aren't just ideas, they're reputations. Careers. Immortality, if things go very, very well. The library doesn't just collect poems. It judges them. And judgment, it turns out, is everyone's favorite sport. Here's your mainstream historical fact, slid casually across the table. Alexandrian scholars were deeply involved in literary criticism, editing, and establishing authoritative versions of works like Homer's epics. Multiple versions existed. Lines differed. Passages wandered. So librarians compared manuscripts, argued over authenticity, and decided which lines were real Homer and which were suspiciously Homer-adjacent. Congratulations, this is textual criticism being born, and it's already causing fights. You overhear one scholar accusing another of favoring a version of a poem simply because it supports his theory. The accused responds that the theory is correct because the version supports it. This circular logic earns applause, groans, and one thrown figure. Academic discourse is thriving. A quirky tidbit sneaks in through the side door. Poets at Alexandria sometimes wrote deliberately obscure, hyperreferential works just to show they belonged here. Poetry becomes a flex. If no one understands it, that's not a flaw, it's proof you didn't read enough. Someone mutters that the goal is to be admired, not enjoyed. Someone else nods solemnly. Rivalries are everywhere. Schools of thought form. Alliances shift. A librarian's opinion can elevate a poet or quietly bury them. You realize that in a place that decides what gets copied, criticism isn't commentary, it's survival. If your work isn't favored, it may simply stop being reproduced. No dramatic burning, just silence, which is somehow worse. Historians still argue how much personal bias shaped the literary canon that survived antiquity. Did we inherit the best works, or the ones that pleased a handful of influential librarians with strong opinions and limited patience? There's no clean answer, only the texts that made it through. You notice how petty it all feels, and how human. Someone is still mad about a review from 10 years ago. Someone else pretends not to notice when their rival speaks. There's a running joke that the quickest way to make an enemy in Alexandria is to footnote someone incorrectly. The quickest way to make two enemies is to correct yourself later. And yet, beneath the drama, something important is happening. Standards are being formed. Language is being refined. The idea that texts can be compared, improved, corrected, this becomes normal here. Messy, biased, argumentative, but powerful. Literature stops being fixed and starts being interrogated. As you slip out of the hall, the voices fade, but the tension lingers. You understand now that the library isn't just a sanctuary for knowledge. It's a pressure cooker. Ideas survive here not just by being true or beautiful, but by being defended, cited, and occasionally fought over with impressive levels of spite. You smile, a little tired, because it turns out even the greatest library in history couldn't escape academic drama. It just archived it. You feel the shift before anyone announces it. The conversations change tone. The jokes get quieter. The laughter has a quick glance over the shoulder attached to it. This is what happens when knowledge moves too close to power and stays there too long. The library has never been separate from politics. That was the deal from the beginning. Royal funding, royal protection, royal expectations. But now you're seeing the sharper edge of that arrangement. Knowledge isn't just admired anymore. It's useful. And usefulness makes rulers nervous in a very specific way. Here's your mainstream historical fact, delivered without fanfare. Scholars in Alexandria often served the state directly. They advised on calendars, navigation, engineering, taxation, and administration. Their work helped ships sail farther, crops grow on time, and borders stay mapped. This wasn't abstract thinking floating harmlessly above society. This was applied intelligence. And once rulers notice that, they start asking what else you might do for them. You pass a room where maps are spread across tables, weighted down with stones. Not artistic maps, functional ones. Coastlines corrected. Distances argued over. Someone mutters that an error here could sink a fleet. Someone else mutters that an error here could sink them. Knowledge is suddenly heavy. A quirky tidbit drifts through the hallways. Some scholars allegedly softened or framed their conclusions depending on who was listening. Not lies, never lies, but careful emphasis. The stars suggest this interpretation. The numbers lean that way. Historians still argue how often Alexandrian scholarship was shaped by political pressure versus genuine uncertainty. The truth likely lives in the uncomfortable middle, as it usually does. You sense how patronage reshapes behavior. Certain topics flourish because they're useful. Others quietly starve. Astronomy thrives. Engineering thrives. Pure speculation without obvious benefit struggles unless it's fashionable. The library still values curiosity, but curiosity now wears a badge and answers questions about return on investment. There's a nervous joke circulating today. The safest theory is one that flatters the king. It earns polite laughter and immediate silence. Someone clears their throat. Someone else changes the subject to geometry, because triangles don't report you. You notice scholars becoming careful with language. Disagreements are wrapped in respect. Critiques are framed as extensions, not corrections. No one wants to be remembered as the person whose footnote offended the wrong court official. Knowledge hasn't stopped being free, but it has learned to walk softly. Historians still argue whether this period represents corruption of scholarship or its natural evolution. Is thinking ever truly independent when it's fed, housed, and protected by power? Or is compromise simply the price of survival in a world where scrolls don't copy themselves? And yet, this is important, it's not all fear. Some scholars thrive here. They enjoy the proximity to influence. They like seeing their ideas shape reality. There's pride in knowing your calculations helped a ship return safely or kept a city fed. Idealism and pragmatism wrestle constantly, and neither wins outright. You pass a young scholar rehearsing an argument aloud, testing different phrasings. Same idea, different emphasis. One version bold, one version safe. He chooses the safer one and exhales. You understand. It's not cowardice. It's strategy. As night settles again, the library glows softly, still alive with thought, but now layered with awareness. Knowledge has weight, consequences. A shelf of scrolls can quietly influence laws, borders, and beliefs. This place doesn't just store wisdom anymore. It shapes power, and is shaped by it in return. You walk on, knowing the balance won't hold forever. It never does. But for now, the library stands at a tense peak, brilliant, indispensable, and increasingly entangled in the machinery of rule. You smell smoke before you see flames, which feels unfair, like history spoiling itself. The air near the harbor is wrong tonight, thick, bitter, anxious. You move faster, because instinct tells you this moment matters, even if no one nearby fully understands how much. Politics has finally caught up to papyrus. Alexandria is no longer just a city of scholars. It's a city caught in someone else's civil war. Here's your mainstream historical fact, set gently but firmly on the table. During Julius Caesar's campaign in Egypt in 48 BC, fires broke out near Alexandria's harbor. Caesar himself later wrote that he ordered ships burned to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The fire spread. What exactly it reached, and how much it destroyed, has been argued about ever since. You stand near the docks as chaos ripples outward. Sailors shout. Soldiers shove. Wind carries embers where no one wants them. Warehouses catch first, wood, rope, oil. Perfect fuel. You can almost hear the collective intake of breath as someone realizes scrolls are stored nearby. Knowledge, famously, is flammable. A quirky tidbit crackles through the panic. Some ancient accounts claim tens of thousands of scrolls were lost in this fire. Others barely mention damage to the library at all. Later writers dramatically inflate numbers. Earlier ones stay frustratingly vague. Historians still argue whether the great library itself burned here, whether only auxiliary storage was affected, or whether the damage was significant but not fatal. If uncertainty were fuel, this debate could keep the fire going forever. You feel the tension between legend and logistics. The library is inland, part of the royal quarter. The harbor is separate. Fire can travel, yes, but not magically. Not selectively. Some texts may have burned. Others almost certainly survived. The problem is that almost certainly doesn't make for a clean story. And humans love clean stories. You watch officials scramble, trying to save what they can. Scrolls are carried hastily, some dropped, some trampled, some abandoned because someone made the calculation, wrong or right, that people matter more than paper. A guard yells that more ships are burning. A scholar yells something unhelpful about irreplaceable manuscripts. Both are correct. Neither is winning. There's a grim joke muttered through clenched teeth. At least now we know fire exists. No one laughs. You realize that this moment becomes a narrative magnet. Centuries from now, people will want a single villain. A single spark. Caesar fits nicely. Powerful. Foreign. Convenient. It's tempting to imagine him casually burning the sum of human knowledge like an afterthought between battles. It makes history feel dramatic. It makes loss feel personal. But history is rarely that tidy. You sense it even now. The library had copies. Duplicates. Distributed collections. Knowledge here wasn't a single pile waiting for a torch. It was a network. Fragile, yes, but resilient in a way legends struggle to accommodate. Damage doesn't mean death. Fire doesn't mean forgetting. Not immediately. Still, something shifts tonight. Even if the library survives structurally, psychologically it's been wounded. The illusion of invincibility cracks. Scholars start thinking about vulnerability. About contingency. About the fact that scrolls don't defend themselves when armies arrive. Historians still argue whether this fire marked the beginning of the end or just an early bruise in a much longer decline. What's clear is that the story of destruction becomes more powerful than the destruction itself. From now on, the library carries a shadow, the idea that it can be lost. You step back as smoke thins, the worst of the flames dying down. Survivors assess damage with hollow eyes. No one knows the full cost yet. They may never. Lists will be made. Guesses offered. Numbers argued over. Future generations will inherit the uncertainty along with the myth. As dawn creeps in, pale and indifferent, you realize something quietly devastating. The library's greatest enemy isn't fire. It's time plus instability plus people telling simplified stories. Tonight gives those stories their favorite prop. You walk away from the harbor knowing the library still stands, but also knowing that from this moment on, its fate will be narrated as a tragedy in progress, whether or not the facts fully agree. And once a story like that takes hold, it's very hard to extinguish. You don't notice the loss right away. That's the unsettling part. The library doesn't collapse. The doors don't slam shut. No one nails a sign to the columns saying knowledge closed until further notice. Instead, things shift. Quietly. Gradually. Like a city adjusting its weight after an injury. You're walking through Alexandria again, but your feet take you somewhere slightly different now, southwest, away from the old royal quarters confidence and toward a place that feels humbler. This is where the idea of the library learns how to survive by changing shape. Here's your mainstream historical fact, placed carefully. Alongside the original library, ancient sources describe a secondary institution often called the daughter library, commonly associated with the Serapeum, the temple complex dedicated to the god Serapis. Whether it was a branch, a continuation, or something looser is debated, but what's clear is that scholarly activity and collections persisted beyond the first library's golden age. You step into the Serapeum's shadow, and it feels different. Less imperial flex, more endurance. The marble is still impressive, but the atmosphere has changed. This isn't about collecting the entire world anymore. It's about holding on to what remains. Preservation replaces ambition. Maintenance replaces expansion. The mood is quieter, more practical, and honestly, a little tired. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you linger. Serapis himself was a deliberately blended deity, Greek and Egyptian elements stitched together to unify a divided population. That makes the Serapeum an oddly perfect place for the library's afterlife. Hybrid, adaptive, a compromise that works because it has to. Scholars still come here. They still argue. They still teach. But the energy is different. Funding is less reliable. Royal attention drifts. New political priorities rise. You sense the slow creep of neglect. Not malicious, just bureaucratic. Roofs need repairs. Scrolls need recopying. Both require money. Money increasingly goes elsewhere. Historians still argue whether the daughter library housed a significant portion of the original collection or whether it was more symbolic, a continuation in spirit rather than scale. The frustrating answer, again, is uncertainty. Fires, reforms, and shifting administrations don't leave neat paper trails. You notice something subtle but important. Copying slows. When resources tighten, choices get sharper. Not everything gets preserved anymore. Some texts are deemed less urgent, less useful, less fashionable. This is how loss usually happens, not with flames, but with triage. Someone nearby jokes, softly, that the Serapeum is where scrolls come to retire. The laughter is gentle, affectionate, and a little sad. You realize that survival has a cost. The library's universal ambition fades. In its place is something narrower, more local, more cautious. Scholars focus on teaching, commentary, and preservation rather than grand synthesis. It's not failure. It's adaptation. But it does mean fewer new ideas enter the system. Historians still argue whether this phase represents decline or transformation. Is a library less important because it stops growing? Or is endurance itself a form of success in an unstable world? As evening settles over the Serapeum, lamps flicker on. The work continues. Quietly. Stubbornly. Knowledge hasn't died. It's just learned to whisper instead of shout. You leave with the sense that the library's story isn't a single rise and fall. It's a long negotiation with reality. And right now, reality is asking it to be smaller. You feel it in the streets before you see it in the buildings. Alexandria sounds different now. The arguments haven't stopped, but they've changed pitch. Where once debates tangled over meter and measurement, now they catch on belief, sharp, personal, and far less forgiving. This is a city learning a new language of certainty, and certainty doesn't like competition. You walk past temples that feel watched, past churches that feel guarded. Faith is no longer just a private affair or a philosophical stance. It's law, identity, and social alignment rolled into one. The library, what remains of it, exists in this new atmosphere like an artifact from a previous climate. Here's your mainstream historical fact, placed carefully so it doesn't crack. By the late 4th century CE, Christianity had become dominant in the Roman world, and imperial policies increasingly favored it. Pagan institutions lost protection. Funding dried up. Some were actively suppressed. Alexandria, famously volatile, felt these changes intensely. You move closer to the Serapeum again, sensing that this place, once adaptive and resilient, is now vulnerable in a new way. The temple is more than stone, it's a symbol. And symbols attract attention. The wrong kind. A quirky tidbit drifts through the crowd like a rumor with teeth. The Serapeum housed not just scrolls, but statues, ritual objects, and relics tied to older religious traditions. For some, that made it sacred. For others, intolerable. The same walls meant preservation to one group and provocation to another. Tension thickens. You hear sermons that frame old knowledge as dangerous, misleading, corrupting. Not all learning, just that learning. The kind associated with gods who no longer have official approval. The kind that doesn't bow easily. Historians still argue whether this conflict was primarily theological, political, or social. The answer shifts depending on who you ask and what they're defending. You feel the moment fracture when violence breaks out. Not sudden, cinematic violence. Chaotic human violence. Shouting. Stone on stone. Authority asserting itself with religious language attached. In 391 CE, the Serapeum is destroyed. Statues toppled. Spaces repurposed or erased. Whether scrolls were still stored there at that moment, and how many, is fiercely debated. Some sources suggest the collections were already gone or diminished. Others imply a final, devastating loss. This is where the myth wants to settle. A dramatic end. A single event. A clear villain. It's satisfying in a tragic way. But reality resists the neatness. The library had already been shrinking, shifting, thinning out. What happens here feels less like murder and more like the last breath of something long ill. You stand amid the aftermath, listening to arguments about what was destroyed and what was merely symbolic. People argue even now, centuries later, because loss demands explanation. Someone wants to believe that if they can name the moment knowledge died, they can undo it in imagination. You notice something quieter, almost missed. Learning doesn't stop. It moves. It hides. It changes clothes. Teachers teach in private homes. Texts circulate hand to hand. Commentary replaces collection. The center collapses, but the edges persist. Historians still argue whether the destruction of the Serapeum marked the true end of the Library of Alexandria or simply the end of its public, institutional form. What's clear is that the age of universal, state-backed scholarship in Alexandria is over. As dusk falls, you realize the tragedy isn't just what was lost, but how the story narrows. The library becomes a cautionary tale instead of a living place, a symbol instead of a practice. And symbols, once fixed, rarely get a chance to grow. You walk more carefully now, not because the streets are unsafe, though they sometimes are, but because the city feels brittle. Alexandria still hums, still trades, still argues, but the confidence is gone. The kind of confidence that assumes tomorrow will look like today, only smarter. This is late Alexandria. Thought continues here, but it does so with its shoulders slightly hunched. You find yourself following a smaller circle of voices, fewer in number, tighter in trust. Philosophy hasn't vanished, it's gone intimate. Teaching happens in homes, in shaded corners, in rooms where the door can be closed if needed. This is where you encounter the library's final echo, not in a building, but in a person. Here's your mainstream historical fact, introduced gently. Hypatia of Alexandria, a philosopher, mathematician, and teacher active in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, taught Platonic philosophy and mathematics in a city increasingly divided by religious and political tension. She is not the last librarian, that's a myth, but she represents something just as important, continuity. You listen as she explains geometry, patiently, precisely, without spectacle. Circles. Ratios. The quiet beauty of proof. There's no grand institution behind her now. No royal stipend. Just reputation, respect, and the fragile protection of students who value learning enough to risk association with it. A quirky tidbit drifts through her lessons. Hypatia reportedly constructed scientific instruments, astrolabes, hydrometers, devices meant to measure rather than impress. In another age, these might have sat proudly in the Museion. Now their tools passed hand to hand, knowledge distilled into objects small enough to hide. The atmosphere around her is tense in a way that has nothing to do with scholarship. She's respected across religious lines, admired by pagans, Christians, and officials alike, but that broad respect becomes dangerous. In polarized times, neutrality looks like defiance. Influence without clear allegiance unsettles everyone. Historians still argue how much her death in 415 CE was about religion, how much about politics, and how much about fear of an independent woman with authority in a collapsing civic structure. What's clear is that it wasn't an attack on science in some cartoonish sense. It was violence born of instability, rumor, and power struggles that had been simmering for decades. You don't linger on the brutality. That's not what matters here. What matters is what follows. After Hypatia, Alexandria doesn't suddenly forget mathematics. Knowledge doesn't evaporate, but something fragile breaks. The idea that a city can openly host diverse schools of thought under shared civic protection fades. You walk on, sensing the end of an era without a single closing door. The library's spirit, debate, preservation, curiosity, still exists, but it no longer has a home that can defend it. Learning survives where it can, how it can. And as night falls, you understand that the Library of Alexandria didn't die in fire or fury alone. It thinned. It scattered. It became human-sized again. You don't feel an ending arrive. There's no bell, no final argument, no last scroll ceremoniously placed on a shelf and locked away. What you feel instead is distance. Time stretching. The library slipping from lived experience into story. You're standing in Alexandria again, but now it's layered, Roman, Christian, later Islamic, modern, each era built on the dust of the last. The great institution you've been walking through for hours exists mostly in quotation marks now. The Library of Alexandria. A phrase heavy with longing. Here's your final mainstream historical fact, set down carefully. By the time Arab forces entered Alexandria in the 7th century, the Great Library as a centralized institution no longer existed. Later stories claim the conquerors destroyed it, burning scrolls for fuel, but these accounts appear centuries after the fact and conflict with earlier evidence. Historians still argue whether these stories reflect reality, propaganda, or humanity's need to blame someone specific for an old, complicated loss. And that's the thing. Everyone wants a villain. Fanatics. Emperors. Someone to point at so the story feels finished. But the library resists that. It fades instead, eroded by neglect, politics, budget cuts, religious shifts, and the slow violence of not copying things often enough. A quirky tidbit lingers here like a half-remembered dream. Medieval scholars later spoke of the library as if it contained all knowledge, sometimes even books that hadn't been written yet. Infinite scrolls. Lost technologies. Secrets that could have saved the world. None of that is true. And yet the myth persists, because the truth, that knowledge is fragile and maintenance heavy, is less romantic. You realize the library's afterlife is more powerful than its reality. It becomes a symbol of everything humanity fears losing: wisdom, openness, shared memory. Every burned book, every defunded school, every corrupted archive gets measured against Alexandria, whether it deserves to be or not. And here's the quiet irony. The library failed at its grandest goal. It did not save everything, but it succeeded at something subtler. It proved that gathering knowledge across cultures was possible. That classification mattered. That translation mattered. That questioning authority with evidence mattered. Those ideas survived, even when the building didn't. You feel the story slowing now, the edges softening, the details blending into atmosphere. So you let the pace drop. The sentences stretch. The urgency dissolves. You imagine the rustle of papyrus one last time, not as loss, but as presence. Scholars arguing gently. Lamps dimming. Someone carefully re-rolling a scroll, believing, without proof, that it will matter to someone, someday. That belief turns out to be the library's true legacy. Because here you are, listening, remembering, carrying the story forward, not on shelves, but in attention. So breathe. Let the city fade. Let the arguments quiet. Knowledge doesn't need marble halls to survive, just minds willing to hold it for a while. And tonight, that's you.